A study recently published by the Rosalynn Institute and Duke University offers solutions for how communities can support family caregivers during a natural disaster. And it is my pleasure that Dr. Jennifer Olsen, CEO of the Rosalynn Institute, is here to talk with us about the results of that study. And Dr. Olsen, in a strange bit of fate, we happen to be talking as Hurricane Nicole is actually churning right outside my door. So you can imagine how interested I am to hear about the results of this study.
Thank you, Gary, for talking to me about this. And I hope you stay safe through whatever comes outside your door. As we know, caregivers aren't immune to natural disasters, but are rarely part of the preparedness and response conversation. So one of the things that we talked to local communities about was how first responders aren't aware of who caregivers are in their community, right?
Yeah.
And so that meant, is there a registry or a sticker on a door, or how do we create more of that awareness for first responders? But the other part of that was that we learned that many first responders thought that most people who are ill, aging, or disabled live in a facility, which we know many caregivers, that is not true for most families. And so we would talk to individuals who are caring for someone with dementia, and the first responders would be convinced that all people who are struggling with Alzheimer's are in memory care units, not in their very community. So a lot of awareness building on that end is necessary. And the other big thing is that while states and local governments may create shelter settings or medical special needs shelters, they may not have the right mix of location for somebody who's struggling with cognitive issues or who has, sensory issues. And so the caregiver is unsure of if they bring their care recipient, their loved one, to this location, if it's going to be the right setting for them. If it's a very loud environment, that's not great for someone with traumatic brain injury, with constant noise and light. Well, then I should stay at home, even if that's really risky. How do we communicate to caregivers what environments are going to be safe for the types of individuals that they're caring for? And how do we thoughtfully create a space that is for both caregiver and care recipient?
How does the survey teach us to reach out to these and train these first responders?
So that's some of the work we're doing now in our local community in rural Georgia. We're working with our sheriff's department on these education elements and on thinking about if there are tips and toolkits for both family caregivers and those first responders. We're also doing some work with the Department of Veterans Affairs focused on caregivers of veterans, so that when they do their messaging out to veterans, they're also thinking about what are the messages that need to go to the caregivers of veterans, or how do we make sure that community of caregivers is part of what we're doing.
Is there anything you could suggest to not just first responders, but the government, agencies who interact with the caregivers, like the postal workers, or anything you can suggest to them to recognize what they're seeing when they see a family with the caregiving challenges?
I think one part of that is kind of creating this understanding that if you come to a house or are engaging with someone who has any sort of medical or any sort of challenge, right, that there is often someone else who is either living in that home or who is supporting that person, to always look for the person behind the person that you're treating or connecting with. Because that person will both have significant information that would help you in what you're trying to engage with the individual on, but also they're going to be one of your biggest allies in either messaging or suggesting to someone kind of what to do next. I think the other thing that we have seen and are experiencing is that we often think about emergency workers as a category of individuals, but don't recognize that amongst the emergency workforce, there are caregivers.
Yeah.
You know, there are caregivers in the postal service, there are caregivers in the sheriff's department, EMS, fire. And that means that they are themselves kind of grappling with these issues, but may not be thinking there are others like me in the community I'm serving. So even just having some of those stories getting shared is an important step.
And one of the things I saw, it's that you want to design specialized emergency preparation and management services. So that sounds like an all-inclusive overview of what the system can create to help caregivers in the community.
Yes, I think we'd like to see that when a community, goes through a process to be, hurricane ready or hurricane prepared, you see those signs on the street. Is there a similar process and kind of certification to show that you're caregiver supportive or you're caregiver ready for these disasters? And that means not just during the 24 hours prior. Is your annual planning including kind of caregiver like intention? Is your resilience and response recovery activities thinking about caregivers? And are you recognizing that indeed caregivers are the first responders in most households? And so you'd be well served to support them. We've also been thinking about how supporting caregivers can help to reduce some of the burdens on emergency services during a disaster, right? If the caregiver has a plan in place and understands what their options are, perhaps they'll be less likely to call 911 with that non-urgent issue. So we think of this potentially reducing the demand in the most critical hours.
And also connecting with the caregivers at the point that, that they need the support. That idea of a caregiver registry per community is really intelligent. How do you see that manifesting itself?
Well, that's what we're just getting started on thinking about. It's a lot easier when you live in a town of 700. So perhaps, if we can figure it out here, we can think about how it plays out in other communities. But we'd love to work with first responders across the country who are trying to solve this in their own backyard. I suspect, as I said before, there are many people who are working in emergency operations centers who are concerned if the home health aide is going to make it in the middle of the flood while they're trying to save others.
So you're using your community as a test case that you
That's
expand out.
right.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
I think that's fantastic. Have you started doing that yet, or is it just in a planning stage?
Just in the planning stage, and because we had started this work actually and this research pre-COVID, and like all projects, COVID had thrown us some challenges, but it also presented us some unique differences to explore. So this research, we talked to caregivers who had both experienced natural disasters and had experienced COVID to say, like, what parts of preparedness and response in both of these types of events did you feel like was lacking, or did you need more support around?
And I could see where there are differences based on where you live. We have, things right outside our coast to duck and hunker down from. And other parts of the country, they have earthquakes, and other parts of the country, they have avalanches.
I think there's both, like there's a diversity of types of disaster, and there's also a diversity in like levels of community readiness. Both of those things have to be taken into account when thinking about caregiver supports in this space. But I think if we kind of go back to what's the first thing we would ask any organization to do who's in that emergency response field, to say, like, have I thought about how this is going to play out for a caregiver who's caring for someone who has mobility challenges? Have I thought through what that looks like? Cognitive challenges, sensory challenges. Is it clear, are my instructions clear that they are like, that there's a plan and a place for individuals and their caregivers? And then the diversity of disasters that they're planning for can be grappled with.
Did anything surprise you when RCI and Duke was putting this survey together?
I think that one of the biggest surprises was that caregivers had felt like they had seen and gotten a lot of what we call traditional lists of supplies and services. That especially if you live in a place that's hurricane prone, you've gotten mailings and seen plenty of commercials about making sure you have medicine, water, food. But that, like, and those things were people had thought about for themselves. But when it came to all of the supplies and supports and services that they need for someone else, that was a place of extreme stress and challenge. That they had figured out and kind of could follow the checklist for their own needs, but there was no similar checklist of, if I'm caring for someone who needs certain types of refrigerated food, how am I going to deal with that? If I'm caring for someone who is prone to wandering, what am I going to do about that? That's a different list, a different supply list. It's both, skills that you have to have and scenarios you have to walk through. And that caregivers felt like there hadn't been any supports that they had seen that helped them with that whole set of challenges.
What advice do you have at this point for family caregivers to prepare for emergencies?
I think the biggest thing I would say is that you can and should feel empowered to reach out to your emergency services in a non-disaster time. So if you're living in, blizzard area, call them in the summer. If you're in hurricane space, call them in the winter. Tell them your scenario and ask what the plan is in your community for individuals that are experiencing what you're experiencing. Eventually, obviously, we'd love communities to have thought through all those things for caregivers. But at this point, the best thing we can suggest is that caregivers, much like they have their care plan for day-to-day operations, that they think about a care plan for disasters.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the timing of this conversation.
Sure.
I know obviously you help a lot of caregivers. Please send my regards to Mrs. Carter. And
I see the background back there. So great to see the cover. Yeah, we have that framed in our office. So I've seen that cover many times in the halls.